Welcome to Voice of Stories. Discover tales that inspire, captivate, and bring words to life. Subscribe for unforgettable stories.
Title: The Cortez Legacy. The Cortez mansion loomed over Boston like an untouched fortress. Its modern glass structure gleamed in the late afternoon sun, reflecting the vibrant hues of autumn. Inside, Leonardo Cortez, a self-made millionaire, stood by the window of his penthouse office, gazing out at the sprawling city below. His mind, however, wasn't on the city or his empire. It was lost in a memory, a haunting echo of happier times. His late wife, Catherine, their son, Lucas. A life that had once seemed perfect until tragedy struck. The sound of the door creaking open snapped him back to the present. Margaret, his loyal assistant, entered, holding a thick folder in her hands. "Mr. Cortez, here are the CVS of the candidates you requested," she said, her voice professional but betraying a trace of concern. "For the new nanny position." Leonardo's dark eyes skimmed the pages, his thoughts distant. "How many?" he asked, his tone flat. 15. All highly qualified. Experience with special needs children. They all have glowing references." He let out a sigh, flipping through the pages. On paper, they all seemed perfect. But Leonardo had learned long ago that appearances were deceiving. He had to be careful. His son's safety came before everything else. "Set up interviews with the top 3, he instructed, setting the folder aside. "But I don't want any more temporary solutions. Lucas needs someone permanent." Margaret hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly to the door that led to Leonardo's personal space. "Doctor," Matthews called. "He's concerned about Lucas. He says he needs stability. The constant turnover. It's not helping his health." "I paid Dr. Matthews to manage Lucas's health, not tell me how to run my household," Leonardo replied coldly. He wasn't in the mood for advice. Margaret nodded, though she knew that her boss was clinging to control, afraid of the unknown. "He also mentioned that Lucas asked if you would have dinner with him tonight." Leonardo's jaw tightened. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been able to make it home for dinner with his son. "Tell him I'll be there at 7, he said, his voice softening. "But alone." He turned his gaze back to the window, where the city lights were beginning to twinkle as dusk settled in. He reached for a framed photo on his desk, Catherine's smiling face, those vivid green eyes full of life. It had been 5 years since the accident, 5 years since he lost her. The sound of a cough broke the stillness. Lucas, his 8-year-old son, was curled up on the couch in the grand living room, a blanket wrapped around him as he watched an ocean documentary on the flat screen. His small body looked fragile, a reminder of the ongoing battle he fought every day. When Lucas saw his father, his face lit up with that familiar, hopeful smile. "Dad, are you having dinner with me tonight?" Leonardo forced a smile, a rare one. "Yes, champ. We'll order that pizza you like." As his son struggled with another coughing fit, Mrs. Peterson, the temporary nanny, stepped in with the inhaler. Leonardo stood by, helpless, watching the fragile life of his son teeter on the edge every single day. Later that evening, Leonardo retreated to his office and began his nightly ritual, monitoring the house's security cameras. His eyes scanned each of the rooms, checking on Lucas, ensuring everything was in order. But then, one name on the list of candidates stood out: Isabella Martinez. Her CV was flawless: experience with children who had special health needs, a background in pediatric nursing, and glowing references. Yet, it wasn't her qualifications that intrigued him the most. It was the warmth in her eyes in the photograph she submitted. Something about her seemed different, genuine. His phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. "Leonardo," the lawyer's voice came through. "I've sent over the documents for the new nanny. Should I include the usual confidentiality clauses?" "Of course," he replied quickly. "And add a clause about the security cameras. Anyone who has nothing to hide shouldn't have a problem with it." Leonardo ended the call and looked back at Isabella's application, deep in thought. Something about her intrigued him in a way no other candidate had. The following day, Isabella Martinez arrived for her interview. The large, sterile meeting room of Cortez Enterprises was stark, filled with modern furnishings and cold steel. The contrast between the room's severity and Isabella's calm presence was immediately striking. Leonardo studied her carefully as she sat across from him. Her posture was poised but not rigid, and she met his gaze with quiet confidence. There was something about her calmness, her steadiness, that felt like a breath of fresh air in the oppressive environment he had created around himself. "Your resume is impressive, Ms. Martinez," he began, flipping through the pages. 6 years working with children with complex medical needs, exceptional references. "Thank you, Mr. Cortez," Isabella said, her voice even but warm. "But I believe perfection is a myth. What I offer is something different: honesty, dedication, and compassion." Leonardo paused. It was the first time he'd heard a candidate speak so candidly. "Tell me about your last job." "I was caring for a young boy named William," Isabella replied, her tone softening. "He had cystic fibrosis. It was challenging but rewarding work. Unfortunately, he passed away 6 months ago. Since then, I've been taking some time to heal." He could see the brief flicker of pain in her eyes, but it was quickly masked. "And why do you think you're ready to care for another child like Lucas?" "Because loss taught me empathy," she said simply. "It taught me that real care goes beyond just administering medicine. It's about being there, truly present." Leonardo leaned back in his chair, intrigued despite himself. He knew this interview was different. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice hardening, "I should warn you, there are cameras throughout this house. Your privacy will be limited." "I understand," she replied without hesitation. "I'd expect nothing less from a parent who wants to protect his child. Trust isn't built on surveillance, Mr. Cortez. It's built on actions." Her response took him by surprise. He watched her for a long moment before speaking again. "Would you like to meet Lucas?" Isabella spent the next hour with Lucas, and Leonardo observed their interaction from the hallway, unsure of what he was expecting. But the sight that met his eyes was something he hadn't anticipated. Isabella spoke to Lucas not just as a caregiver, but as someone who truly understood him. She listened to his thoughts, answered his questions with genuine interest, and even managed to incorporate breathing exercises into their conversation without him noticing. When they were finished, Lucas looked up at his father. "Dad, she's different," he said with a smile. "I like her." Leonardo's chest tightened, a mixture of emotions flooding him. Maybe Lucas was right. Maybe Isabella was exactly what he needed. The next day, after reviewing the employment contract and discussing the terms with his lawyer, Leonardo made his decision. "Margaret," he said, still gazing at the papers in front of him. "Cancel the other interviews. Miss Martinez starts tomorrow." Margaret paused, surprised by his swift decision. "Are you sure?" He nodded. "I am." 2 months passed, and Isabella settled into a comfortable rhythm with Lucas. The boy was healthier, happier, and had even started talking about things he hadn't discussed in years, like his dreams of seeing the ocean. Leonardo found himself paying more attention to Lucas's well-being than ever before. He even canceled meetings to spend time with his son, something he hadn't done since before Catherine's death. But just as things seemed to be falling into place, an unexpected discovery threatened the delicate balance that had been restored. While Isabella was organizing paperwork in Leonardo's office one afternoon, she knocked over a file. As she picked it up, a police report spilled out, details about the accident that had taken Catherine's life. It spoke of suspicious circumstances surrounding the car's brake system failure. Isabella froze, unable to stop reading. Leonardo's voice cut through the stillness. "What are you doing?" Isabella quickly backed away, holding the paper close to her chest. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "Get out," he snapped, his voice icy. Isabella left the room, her heart pounding. She'd crossed a line. But what she didn't realize was that this moment would set in motion a chain of events that would uncover secrets hidden deep within the Cortez family. Leonardo rose suddenly, his glass tipping over and spilling its contents. "You don't understand what it's like to lose someone," he said, his voice tight. Isabella's reply was soft but resolute. "I know more than you think." Leonardo's eyes narrowed, his body rigid with tension. "William wasn't the first person I've lost," she continued, her voice calm despite the weight of her words. "And with every loss, I've learned that silence doesn't shield you, it suffocates you." The room fell into a heavy silence. Leonardo's gaze was fixed out of the window, his posture stiff. "It's my fault," he whispered at last, his voice almost breaking. "Catherine wanted to attend Lucas's recital. I was tied up with an important merger. I told her to go alone, but she insisted on driving herself." Isabella took a step closer, her voice gentle yet firm. "If you had gone with her, the accident might never have happened." Leonardo shook his head. "Or I could have lost them both," he murmured, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "There were suspicions of sabotage. Someone wanted to hurt me. They got to her, Isabella. Catherine died because of me." "You can't blame yourself," she said, the certainty in her voice carrying through. Leonardo turned to face her, his eyes filled with anguish. "How can you be so sure?" he whispered, the grief of years pressing against his words. Isabella took a breath, her words coming softly. "Because I see how you protect Lucas, how you do anything for him." She hesitated, then added, "The way Catherine would have. She would never want you to carry this alone." A moment of silence passed between them. Isabella realized too late that her words had slipped out. She turned toward the door. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "Isabella," he interrupted, his voice suddenly tender, almost pleading. "Please stay." She paused, her hand on the doorknob. Leonardo's voice came again, softer this time. "Lucas needs you. And maybe I do too." A scream from upstairs interrupted them both. They rushed to Lucas's room and found the boy wide-eyed and sobbing. "Mommy!" he cried, his small body trembling. "I dreamt about Mommy." Leonardo stood frozen for a moment, then carefully sat on the edge of the bed and pulled Lucas into his arms. "Do you want to hear about the day your mom took you to see the dolphins for the first time?" His voice cracked, but he pushed on. Lucas, still sniffling, nodded, his big green eyes filled with curiosity. Isabella quietly stepped back, sensing that the moment was private, but Leonardo called out, "Stay, please." So she did. As Leonardo spoke of Catherine, of her laughter, her love of the sea, her zest for life, the room seemed to fill with a lightness, a warmth that had been absent for too long. Lucas eventually fell asleep, a small smile tugging at his lips as he drifted into peaceful slumber, comforted by the memories of the mother he'd lost too soon. But the air between Leonardo and Isabella had changed. The shared intensity of the night, the unsaid words and lingering glances, had created an undercurrent neither could ignore. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at the Cortez mansion shifted. Leonardo alternated between moments of distant professionalism and brief, fragile moments of closeness. Lucas, ever perceptive, noticed the changes and, in his innocent way, chose to ask the question that no one else dared. One afternoon, while they were in the pool for Lucas's therapy session, the boy swam up to Isabella with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Isabella, do you like my dad?" The question caught her off guard, and she almost dropped the flotation device in her hands. "Of course I do, Lucas. Your dad is a good man." "No, like him," he pressed, his grin widening. "I saw you two looking at each other at dinner, like the old photos of Mom and Dad." Isabella felt her face flush as she struggled to maintain composure. Before she could answer, Margaret arrived at the edge of the pool, calling for her. "Ms. Martinez, Mr. Cortez requests your presence in his office immediately." Isabella stood quickly, her heart racing as she made her way to Leonardo's study. When she arrived, Leonardo stood by the window, his back to her. He seemed almost stiff, his posture betraying his unease. "We need to talk," he said without turning around. "About Lucas. About us." Isabella's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. He finally turned to face her. "I'm not blind. I see how Lucas is becoming attached to you. I see how things are changing." His voice hardened. "But change isn't always a good thing, especially when it puts my son's well-being at risk." Isabella met his gaze, unyielding. "Is that really what this is about? You're afraid of him getting hurt? But are you really just protecting him, or are you protecting yourself?" Leonardo faltered, his hand running through his hair, a gesture that revealed more than he intended. "Catherine and I, we had plans, dreams for our future. I promised I would protect Lucas from any more pain. And you've done that well, but at what cost?" Isabella's voice softened as she stepped closer. "Lucas needs love, not walls. He needs to be able to trust again. He needs to connect with people, even if it means risk." Leonardo looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "What about me, Isabella?" he asked quietly. "What happens when I risk too?" The question hung in the air, but before she could answer, a voice interrupted them. "Dad, look what I can do in the pool." Lucas burst into the room, soaking wet and grinning ear to ear. Margaret followed behind him, holding a towel. Isabella quickly regained her composure, smiling as she ushered Lucas out of the room. Later that evening, the storm outside Boston mirrored the emotional tempest inside Leonardo's home. A severe weather front had triggered a respiratory crisis in Lucas, his condition worsening by the hour. Isabella and Leonardo were both on edge, the pressure building as they worked together to stabilize the boy. Isabella kept her voice calm as she monitored the machine. "His heart rate is too fast. We need to keep him calm." Leonardo paced the room, his anxiety palpable. "I've called the ambulance. We need to get him to the hospital." "No," Isabella said, shaking her head. "The storm will make it worse. We need to keep him here. I need you to sit down with him." She motioned to the bed, her voice steady. "Sit, breathe with him. He'll follow your rhythm." Leonardo hesitated for only a moment, then obeyed, settling onto the bed with Lucas nestled between him and Isabella. The three of them sat like that for what felt like hours, the storm outside raging but their hearts sinking, their breathing matching. Slowly, Lucas's condition stabilized. "Tell me a story, Dad," Lucas whispered between breaths. Leonardo looked at Isabella for a moment, his chest tightening at the request. But then, he began, his voice breaking slightly. "It was a summer night when your mother and I first met. She was dancing in the rain." Isabella smiled softly, her heart aching as Leonardo spoke of Catherine's wild, untamed spirit. They had both known the storm in different ways, and now they were learning to find peace in the chaos together. The next morning, Margaret entered the room to find them as they had been all night, united in their vigil, with Lucas asleep between them. The world outside was quiet, but the storm inside them was only just beginning. "Coffee's ready," Margaret announced gently, noticing the exhaustion in both their eyes. She smiled quietly, seeing what they couldn't yet admit. Some storms bring renewal, she thought. Later that afternoon, Leonardo found Isabella alone in the library, preparing materials for Lucas's school project. He closed the door behind him, the weight of what he was about to say heavy on his shoulders. "We need to talk," he said again. "This time it's about everything," he added softly. Isabella stood, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What's happened?" she asked. Leonardo's voice was filled with urgency. "The sabotage. It wasn't from a competitor, it was someone inside the company," Maxwell Bennett confessed. "I need you to understand why I built all these walls around me, why I made it so difficult to trust. She listened quietly, the calm in her demeanor unwavering. Before you came along, I was alone. I couldn't afford to trust anyone again. But you changed everything. Isabella met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm your employee, she said, her voice trembling. I look after your son. I can't do this. Leonardo stepped closer, his voice low but filled with intent. Why not? She stepped back, her breath shaky. Because I promised myself I would never love anyone I could lose again. He reached out, taking